Yeah, can a unified digital currency actually dismantle US dollar hegemony or, will it just collapse under its own weight? In this critique, we are looking at a deeply researched manuscript titled The Collapse of the Dollar Myth, which analyzes the history of US economic hegemony and proposes a unified digital currency and central bank for Islamic and Arab nations to achieve financial independence.
It is such a fascinating read, really.
Yeah, it really is. And to dive straight into how we can elevate this already powerful material, let's start with the tone. Recalibrating the emotive language will significantly elevate the document's academic authority and broaden its persuasive reach to a global audience.
Right, because tone is everything with this kind of subject matter.
Exactly. The material makes a strong case for highlighting the systemic mechanisms of global finance. But let's look closely at the section discussing the political motivations. The author accurately maps the transition from the post-WW2 Marshall Plan directly into the 1971 Nixon shock.
But is there a risk that focusing solely on charged labels might overlook the purely structural and economic incentives that drove these historical events?
Yes, and that brings us to the core weakness here. The text frequently relies on, well, heavily charged, almost polemical terminology. I mean, you see the U.S. described as a mega imperialism.
Mm.
The leadership is accused of arrogance and having a shrinking mind, and there are these repeated references to a malicious deep state controlling global affairs.
Yeah, which really jumps out at you.
It does. This impassioned rhetoric risks alienating neutral or skeptical readers. It ultimately distracts from the otherwise robust and factual historical analysis of Bretton Woods and the petrodollar system.
So the suggestion here is to shift the rhetorical approach from those emotive accusations to objective, data-driven critiques of structural economic imbalances and geopolitical strategy. Just let the mechanics of the history do the heavy lifting.
Because the facts are damning enough on their own. But wait, I want to play devil's advocate for a second. I want to push back on this idea of, sanitizing the language. The author is describing economic sanctions and geopolitical maneuvers that caused very real, measurable human suffering.
Right, I get that.
Doesn't removing words like malicious or arrogance sort of strip away the reality of what actually happens?
Well, it is not about sanitizing the history, right? It is about choosing the most effective weapon to dismantle the opposing argument.
Okay.
When a skeptical academic or a policymaker encounters words like arrogance or malicious, they often instinctively just raise their defenses and dismiss the text as a partisan grievance.
Ah, I see what you mean.
Yeah, if you rely on adjectives, you are basically asking the reader to trust your emotional interpretation of an event. But if you rely on structural realities, you force the reader to confront undeniable mathematics.
Right, so you want the economic facts to deliver the punch, not the adjectives.
Exactly. Take the post-World War II foreign policy as our first concrete example. Instead of arguing that the U.S. acted with arrogance and bullying, just describe the objective reality.
Which is?
That the U.S. strategically leveraged its unharmed industrial base and the Marshall Plan to dictate terms that inherently favored its own economic expansion.
Right, because if you just call it bullying, it sounds like a playground dispute.
Exactly.
But if you describe how the U.S. tied European recovery directly to American exports and dollar-denominated debt, you are exposing a structural capture. You are showing how Europe was essentially turned into a captive market that had to absorb U.S. surplus production to survive.
Which is a much more sophisticated critique. And, another area this applies to is the discussion of multinational corporations. The text refers to a malicious deep state pulling the strings.
Yeah, to a skeptical reader, that framing immediately sounds a bit conspiratorial.
Right, so replace those subjective claims with factual, observable descriptions of how corporate lobbying shapes foreign policy and dictates the flow of wealth from developing nations to Western banks.
You mean detailing the exact mechanisms? Like how sovereign wealth funds from developing nations are funneled into Western financial institutions?
Yes.
And how debt servicing ensures that capital continuously flows from the periphery back to the core?
Yeah, show the reader the plumbing of the financial system. Don't tell them there is a monster in the basement. Show them the blueprints of how the basement was actually designed to trap them.
That's a great way to put it.
And for a third example, just look at how the manuscript describes the sanctions on nations like Iraq, Syria, and Sudan. The text currently calls this thievery and terrorism.
Which, again, focuses heavily on the emotional and human impact.
But framing it objectively as the weaponization of the dollar clearing system is actually a much more devastating critique.
Because it exposes the mechanical chokehold. Like, if a country can't access SWIFT or correspondent banking networks, they physically cannot settle cross-border trades.
No matter how much wealth they have in the ground.
Exactly. Calling it thievery allows a critic to just argue about the legality of international law. But calling it the weaponization of the dollar clearing system forces the critic to admit that fiat currency relies on centralized geopolitical choke points.
Right. So by neutralizing the polemical language, the author transforms this manuscript from a passionate grievance into an airtight, undeniable geopolitical autopsy.
Okay, so moving from how the argument is presented to the core mechanics of the proposed solution, we need to ensure the author's boldest idea is completely bulletproof. Anticipating and actively resolving the practical vulnerabilities of the proposed unified digital currency will make the central argument significantly more resilient against economic skeptics.
Definitely.
Because the author outlines this really fascinating proposition, the creation of an independent central bank and a unified digital currency for a new Islamic and Arab union. And it's strictly restricted from global speculation, used solely for trade among member nations. The author even highlights the Eurozone's structural flaws, mentioning Greece, Italy, and Cyprus.
That makes sense. But could the evidence also support a different conclusion? Like the risk that this new union might accidentally replicate those exact Eurozone disparities, if not carefully managed?
And that is the exact weakness in this section. While the proposal is highly innovative in its restriction of the digital currency to internal trade, it just doesn't fully account for the internal economic disparities among the proposed member states.
Right.
The material rightfully points out that the Eurozone failed because weaker economies became a burden on stronger ones, but it kind of glosses over how this new Islamic and Arab union would avoid the exact same fate when combining wildly wealthy Gulf states with heavily indebted or developing nations.
So the suggestion here is to introduce a dedicated section that aggressively stress tests the proposed central bank against internal economic shocks, unequal resource distribution, and member withdrawal. The author needs to actively play the role of their own harshest critic.
But is it really fair to compare an Arab union to the Eurozone, though? I mean, the Eurozone was a political project forcing incredibly disparate cultures together without a fiscal union. The proposed union here has shared cultural and religious ties, and the Gulf states have massive energy reserves to anchor the system. Isn't it inherently more stable?
Well, economic gravity still applies, regardless of cultural ties. Right now, putting the incredibly wealthy Gulf states and heavily indebted developing nations into one currency is like putting a V8 engine and a bicycle tire on the same axle.
Okay, yeah, that paints a picture.
Right? The text needs to explain the transmission system. How do you distribute that immense economic torque without blowing out the weaker tire, or, conversely, without stalling the engine?
That is a great visual. The reader really needs to see those transmission mechanics in action.
So think about voting rights as a first concrete example of this stress test. Detail a specific mechanism for governance within this new central bank. If you have a wealthy state providing the liquidity and a developing state providing the labor or agricultural imports, how are decisions made? Is it a one nation, one vote system?
Well, if it's one nation, one vote, the wealthy states will never agree to join, because they would be constantly outvoted by a coalition of poorer nations demanding capital injections.
Right.
But then if it is weighted by financial contribution, kind of like the IMF,
Then you've just recreated the exact same unequal hegemonic power structure the author spent the first 80 pages criticizing the United States for building.
Wow. Yeah.
So the manuscript must address the friction this governance structure will inevitably cause and propose a specific, balanced solution.
Makes total sense. And a second crucial stress test to explore is hyperinflation within the union. The text mentions that this digital currency could fund massive developmental loans for infrastructure like dams or power grids in poor member states. Let's say the central bank is used a huge amount of this digital currency to a developing member to build a dam. How does the bank prevent hyperinflation?
Yeah, you have to explain explicitly how the digital currency balances the internal monetary supply.
If you drastically increase the money supply in one corner of the union to build infrastructure, and that currency is freely tradable across borders within the union, you risk devaluing the holdings of the wealthy member states.
Right.
The author needs to detail the specific macroeconomic levers the central bank will pull to absorb that excess liquidity once the dam is actually built.
And what happens if the whole thing fractures? As a third example, the author really needs to clarify the exact protocol for a wealthy member state wanting to rapidly liquidate or withdraw its digital reserves in the event of a localized economic crisis or a sudden geopolitical dispute.
Like the author briefly mentioning the 2017 Gulf crisis in the text. That is the perfect case study. What happens to the unified digital currency if two major member states suddenly sever ties and close their borders?
Because in a traditional fiat system, capital flight happens instantly. Reserves are frozen, correspondent accounts are blocked. If this new system is built on a unified digital ledger, is there a smart contract lockup period?
Right, or is there a phased liquidation protocol that prevents one angry nation from crashing the entire network's liquidity overnight?
Yeah, answering those specific, hard-hitting questions doesn't weaken the proposal at all. It actually fortifies it. It shows the reader that the author understands the immense friction of regional economic integration and has engineered actual bulkheads into the submarine to keep it from sinking.
Exactly.
Okay, so now that we have refined the tone and fortified the economic solution, we need to look at the underlying philosophical why that drives this entire document, which currently feels disconnected from the rest of the text. Weaving the foundational ethical principles throughout the entirety of the text, rather than isolating them in the final chapter, will create a much more cohesive and compelling narrative arc.
Yeah, because the concluding chapter transitions into the spiritual and ethical dimensions of economics.
Right, specifically the Islamic principles that wealth belongs to God, the prohibition of usury or riba, and the duty to invest in sustainable human development rather than just hoarding. Okay, so what I really like about this part is the unique ethical framework it provides.
Building on that point, what if we looked at the historical chapters from the perspective of this ethical framework right from page 1?
I love that idea, because the weakness here is that the text introduces its most unique philosophical frameworks only at the very end of the piece. Because of this structural choice, the first two-thirds of the document read like a standard, secular geopolitical critique. It kind of reads like a textbook.
Yeah, leaving the author's core ethical motivations completely sidelined.
So the suggestion is to introduce the ethical and Islamic economic philosophy in the very first chapter, utilizing it as the primary persistent lens through which U.S. dollar hegemony is evaluated and dismantled.
Right.
But I want to pause here because I can see an author struggling with this. Doesn't the author want to establish the objective, unassailable history first before introducing theology or ethical philosophy? Like, if you start with the ethics, don't you risk alienating the secular economic skeptics we were just talking about trying to win over in the first section?
Not if you frame the ethics as a rigorous economic mechanism rather than just a moral plea.
Okay, how do you mean?
By tacking it onto the end, it feels like an afterthought, like a utopian wish tacked onto a grim reality. But if the ultimate goal of the manuscript is to propose a new digital currency based on these specific ethical principles, then the critique of the current system must be rooted in those exact same principles.
Right.
The reader needs to understand that the current system isn't just failing because of bad policy, it's failing because its foundational ethics are structurally flawed.
So the ethics are essentially the diagnostic tool.
Exactly. So for a concrete example, look at the accumulation of petrodollars by Gulf states and Western banks in Chapter 2. Currently, it's framed purely as a geopolitical maneuver.
Right.
Instead, immediately apply the principle from the final chapter regarding the moral failing of hoarding wealth.
Oh, I see. You contrast the trillions of dollars sitting in Western sovereign wealth funds, earning interest, against the ethical mandate to prioritize basic human needs. You show the systemic failure of hoarding wealth while neighboring nations suffer from poverty and a lack of infrastructure.
Yes, it suddenly gives the historical data a massive sense of moral urgency. It transforms a data point into an indictment.
That's powerful. And a second concrete example would be the manuscript's critique of Keynesian economics and the manipulation of interest rates to control inflation. Right now, the author waits until the very end to bring up the Islamic prohibition of usury, or riba.
Yeah, and that is a massive missed opportunity for a deep structural critique. Don't separate the history from the philosophy. Contrast the two systems in real time.
Under a Keynesian model, when central banks print fiat currency to cover deficits, they inevitably create inflation. To cool down that inflation, they manipulate interest rates, raising the cost of borrowing. This is essentially systemic usury.
They are using riba as a blunt instrument to fix an inflation problem that they themselves created by decoupling from real assets.
Precisely. Show how a system based on real asset backing, like the proposed digital currency restricted to internal trade, structurally solves the Keynesian inflation dilemma.
Because if your currency is hard-capped and tied to real economic output rather than speculative debt, you physically cannot inflate the supply to fund endless deficits.
Exactly. Therefore, you never have to use interest rates or riba to balance the economy.
By explaining the mechanism of how asset-backed digital currencies naturally align with the prohibition of riba, you prove that the ethical framework isn't just a moral ideal, it is a mathematically superior economic model.
You turn a dry macroeconomic comparison into a vibrant, undeniable argument. And for a third example, apply this ethical lens to the Nixon shock in 1971. The author meticulously details how the U.S. defaulted on the gold standard and forced the world onto a floating fiat system.
Oh, I like this. Instead of just treating it as a macroeconomic default, frame it as a fundamental breach of ethical contract.
Yes.
The conclusion discusses the Islamic principles of accountability and transparent dealings in commerce. Link the Nixon shock directly back to that. When the U.S. closed the gold window, they unilaterally changed the terms of a global contract.
Right, so from this perspective, the fiat system isn't just unstable, it is inherently deceptive. The structural reliance on unbacked currency is a violation of trust and transparency.
By moving these ethical pillars to the front, the entire manuscript changes. The author isn't just writing a history of the dollar. They are writing a manifesto for a more transparent, mathematically sound, and humane economic future. It completely elevates the genre of the manuscript.
It really creates a cohesive through line where the reader understands exactly why the history is being told and exactly why the digital currency solution must be engineered the way it is. It integrates the what, the how, and the why into one unbreakable chain of logic.
That's beautifully put. To maximize the impact of this critique, the author should focus on neutralizing polemical language to boost academic credibility, explicitly stress-testing the mechanics of the digital currency to prevent Eurozone-style disparities, and threading the unique ethical and philosophical frameworks throughout the entire text rather than tacking them on at the end.
We really want to thank the listener for submitting such a thought-provoking, deeply researched manuscript.
Absolutely. We warmly invite you to submit your revised draft for another critique in the future. Remember, understanding the historical fault lines of global finance is only half the battle. It's how you engineer the specific structural mechanics of your alternative that determines if it will stand the test of time.